is a leading member of the SWT. He's written lots of books, including this classic, The Revolutionary Ideas of Karl Marx, which has just been reprinted and is available this weekend for £8, and I've got a couple up here if people want them. He's also a professor at King's College London and has spent some of this year standing on picket lines. So, Alex.
Yes, I've been learning, some would say not before time, I've been learning about the class struggle from the sharp end. Now, when one comes to talk about the subject of strategy and tactics in Marxism, the key reference point is Lenin. Lenin was the great Marxist master of strategy and tactics, not simply from the point of view of developing a theoretical understanding of the problem, but also in that his own practice as a revolutionary leader offers a number of very important examples of the kind of problems that are posed for revolutionaries in practice. Now, I'm not going to have time probably to talk much about those examples, but let me just say that in particular, if you look at Tony Gibbs' biography of Lenin, you'll find a lot of rich analysis of those problems, and in particular in the first volume of Cliff's Lenin, which I think has just been republished. Has it been republished or not? Not quite yet, but it has. Good. There's a very important chapter on the subject. But even though Lenin is, as I said, the key figure in the Marxist tradition who focused on this question, the necessity of addressing the problem of strategy and tactics is inherent in the nature of Marxism. And this is for two reasons specifically. First of all, some of you, I imagine, have been to or are currently at university, and if you do a course on political or social thought, you probably have a lecture or two about Marx, where you'll quite likely be told a lot of nonsense about Marx. And part of the nonsense will be the idea that Marx and Marxism are economic determinists. In other words, that Marxism asserts that what happens in history is a product of the unfolding of economic laws working by natural necessity. Now, this is nonsense. Marxism, on the contrary, is, as much as anything else, a theory of great historical crises, of those turning points in history where the contradictions built into the very nature of society develop to a point where a turning point emerges, a turning point where a number of alternatives are posed, where there alternative paths for the society in question to move along. And most fundamentally, there's the alternative between the maintenance of the existing society that is subject to these contradictions, or the revolutionary overthrow of the existing social and political framework and the creation of a new form of society. So Marxism is above all a theory of great historical crises arising from fundamental contradictions built into the structure of society and of the political alternatives that are posed in those crises. So it's not about our economic determination, it's about crises and the development of out of those crises of alternatives, and crucially, which alternative is actually chosen depends critically on the intervention of consciously organised groups of human beings who have particular political projects that, whether or not consciously or not, offer a way out of the crisis in question. And the intervention of these different collective political subjects is critical to how societies emerge from these great knotted points of crisis. Antonio Gramsci is the Marxist who most brought this out. So first of all, Marxism is not an economic determinism. Secondly, and as a consequence of what I just said, central to Marxism is politics. Because it's at the level of politics, as Marx himself puts it, in one of his most important discussions of his theory of history, that human beings become conscious of the underlying conflicts, the deep structural contradictions in society, and fight it out. Now, what is politics? Well, there's a famous remark of Lenin's that's worth pondering. Lenin says that politics is the most concentrated expression of economics. Politics is the most concentrated expression of economics. And it's a brilliant saying, particularly because there are two sides to the saying. On the one hand, politics is the expression of economics. In other words, when we look at what happens in politics, well, it's particularly obvious at the present time, you know, the toings and froings of the different political leaderships in this country and elsewhere in the world aren't autonomous of what's happening at the level of the economy. On the contrary, it's the underlying structural forces and contradictions that develop at the level of the economy that shape and constrain what happens at the level of politics. So one side of what Lenin says is that politics isn't autonomous of economics. But there's another side, namely this idea that politics is the most concentrated expression of economics. In other words, all the different contradictions in society, all the antagonisms and conflicts that shape the society in question, fuse and are concentrated at the level of politics. And that means that politics isn't just a kind of transparent reflection of what happens at the level of economics, but that all the conflicts that are constituted fundamentally at the level of economics find expression and sometimes find solution as well in ways that are often distorted and misrepresented at the political level. And what this means often is that it means that the path that revolutionaries have to take involves quite complicated twists and turns. Let me give one example, which is an issue that has caused a lot of debate among Marxists over the decades, and an issue on which Lenin made very fundamental theoretical and political interventions is the national question. We're internationalists as revolutionaries. We want the overthrow of capitalism as a global system. We want world socialist revolution, etc., etc. But often at the level of politics, issues are posed in terms not simply of appeals to nationalism in the way in which, fortunately, in a pathetically unsuccessful way at every level, we're encouraged to rally round the England team during the World Cup. Sorry, I can't help gloating a bit about that. But in a way, more importantly and more difficultly, when you get the development of movements that are asserting a demand for national self-determination, for the separation, for example, for the separation of a part of a particular state into a distinct new nation state, that can pose very sharp and difficult questions for revolutionaries. Where do you stand in relation to that particular national demand? So, a concrete question for us in the United Kingdom state. One of these days, probably quite soon, there will be a referendum in Scotland on the question of whether or not Scotland should become independent and break away from the United Kingdom. What position do revolutionaries take on that question? Should we be in favour of Scotland breaking away, or should we say that it doesn't really make a difference, or that it's a bourgeois distraction of workers from the class struggle to talk about the national question? I raise the latter option is one that the SWP unfortunately has actually taken in concrete historical circumstances. When there was the first referendum on devolution in Scotland at the end of the 1970s, the SWP on the strong advice of the Scottish members of the SWP, but against the opposition of the Central Committee. I was the unfortunate Central Committee member who tried to carry the argument, was unsuccessfully. Anyway, the SWP took a position of opposing devolution to Scotland, and we had a splendid front page saying "No, nay, never," which was not our proudest moment. But I'm suggesting that we were mistaken in opposing devolution to Scotland in the late 1970s. But why? What were the reasons why we were mistaken? How do you trace the connection between the fundamental economic class struggle between bosses and workers and the demand for Scotland to have autonomy or independence from the United Kingdom? And once you've traced that connection, what concrete stance should revolutionaries take? That's an example of the way in which the fundamental economic contradictions are manifested at the political level, often in distorted and indirect ways. And what that means is the whole process of building, ultimately, a revolutionary movement that can smash capitalism isn't a straight path where everything is clear, but involves all sorts of complicated twists and turns and changes in what we do from one moment to the other. But those twists and turns always have a fundamental underlying orientation, or they do so long as we remain revolutionaries. There remains an orientation on the conquest of political power by the working class. Socialist revolution is the end point of that journey, but the journey takes this very complicated path. Okay, this brings me then to the question of strategy and tactics, because essentially negotiating those twists and turns is what strategy and tactics is all about. Okay, but what is strategy and tactics? Well, Lenin took the distinction from the great Prussian military thinker Clausewitz, who wrote a great book called On War, roughly at the time of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the 19th century. And Clausewitz drew a distinction between strategy and tactics, which is essentially the following: that tactics are the individual methods that an army uses in order to wage and win particular battles. Strategy is the way in which all these particular tactics fit together in order to win a war, not just to win individual battles, not just to defeat the enemy in a particular engagement, but to defeat the enemy overall and impose a fundamental defeat on the enemy. So Lenin then adapts this distinction and applies it to politics. And then the distinction is something like this, that for revolutionaries, tactics are the particular political methods that we use at a concrete moment in order to take the class struggle forward. Strategy is the whole system of these different tactics that fit together in order to secure the objective that I talked about earlier, socialist revolution. Now, why is it important to make that distinction? It's partly important because of what Lenin calls sharp turns in history. When I said that the road to socialist revolution isn't a straight one, the reason why it isn't a straight one isn't simply because the underlying economic contradictions manifest themselves often in complicated, distorted and indirect ways. It's also because of what I said earlier about the nature of history according to Marxism. Marxism, I said, is a theory of great historical crises, of the way in which contradictions come together to produce often explosive and convulsive changes, sharp turns in history, in other words. Lenin talks about sharp turns in history when he's responding to the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914. And in particular, not just to the occurrence, the bursting out of the first great, monstrous imperialist war of the 20th century, but also the collapse of the international socialist movement, because all the individual parties of the second, almost all, the Bolsheviks were, of course, a very important exception, tended to support all the different sections of the Socialist International, tended to support their national governments in the war, so that the international socialist movement disintegrated as a result of the war. And that's a very clear case of a moment of crisis. And the development of these moments of crisis, and the alternatives they pose, these sharp turns in history, forces changes in tactics upon revolutionaries. The methods that previously fitted no longer fit, and you have to change what you're doing. But there's a further complication about tactics that it's important to stress, which is that sometimes we use tactics that seem to be inconsistent with the ultimate goal. And one very important example of this is when revolutionaries stand in elections of different kinds. Now, it seems a very straight contradiction here. We're revolutionaries. In other words, we think the capitalist state can't be reformed. We think it has to be overthrown by the mass action of the working class, organised in workers' councils, Soviets, rank-and-file committees, something like that, that develop a new form of political power. So the objective that we're trying to achieve centres upon a revolutionary act by the working class, the revolutionary seizure of power by the working class. Standing in elections is, in a certain sense, participating in the existing capitalist state, where we run candidates for local elections, for parliamentary elections, etc., etc. And it seems to do that, to use that particular method, seems to contradict the kind of critique of parliamentary socialism, of reformism, and so on, that revolutionaries have maintained really since Marx wrote his classic works on the Paris Commune back in the 1870s. So how do you connect this apparently reformist tactic with a revolutionary strategy? The answer is crucially to do with what is a fundamental requirement for socialist revolution. Socialist revolution is something that is achieved by the working class. The emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class, Marx said. Revolution is a process of self-liberation by the mass of workers. In other words, for revolution to take place, the majority of the working class have to be won to revolution. That means that a fundamental constraint on what we do as revolutionaries at any stage in our existence is an orientation towards the mass of workers and how we can move the situation on in a way that brings the mass of workers closer to an acceptance of revolution. Now, there's a big qualification that I have to make here, which is, of course, we're usually too pathetically weak and small to talk to the real mass of workers, the, 30 million workers here in Britain. I mean, we may feel like a lot here at Marxism, but relative to the mass of workers in British society, we're a piddlingly weak force. So very often, or normally, we're in a situation where we try to relate to a larger section of workers than we ourselves and those we agree us represent. But the fundamental point of principle is still there, that revolutionary politics has to orient itself in a way that wins the majority of work, ultimately succeeds in winning the majority of workers to revolution. But then there's a further problem, which is the influence of reformism on workers. In other words, the mass of workers, I mean, this is particularly true in the advanced capitalist countries, but we shouldn't think that the problem of reformism doesn't manifest itself in different ways in the countries of the global south. The mass of workers tend to be attracted towards politics, in the first instance at any rate. When workers assert themselves as an independent force, they tend to gravitate towards politics that seeks the reform rather than the overthrow of the system. And this isn't because these workers are stupid or cowardly or anything like that, but that to put it simply, revolution is a big thing. For workers to assume the responsibility for taking control of society for themselves involves not simply overthrowing the existing structures of society, but sweeping away the whole weight of ideology that tends to encourage workers to see themselves as incompetent, to push them into a role of passivity, and all the ideologies that fragment workers, that divide them against each other on the basis of gender or race or nation, etc., 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 etc. And therefore, the idea of class struggle that limits itself not to simply to reforming the system, to achieving improvements in the system, fits with the daily experience of workers. It involves a level of struggle, but it involves at the same time limiting that struggle to what seems realistically possible, given that workers aren't yet confident enough to overthrow the system. And that means that for revolutionaries in a country like Britain, we confront, and we still confront, we shouldn't have any illusions about this, the enormous problem of labourism as a force that both seeks to express class struggle but to limit and contain it. And this is crucial to the question of tactics, because very often the tactical arguments that revolutionaries have are to do with what, in the present situation, is the right method to be pursued in order to get us closer to winning the majority. This is a key example of this, is the tactic of the United Front. In other words, when revolutionaries get together, or try and get together, with people, workers, other people in society, who are influenced to a greater or lesser degree by reformist politics, so United Front involves revolutionaries and reformists, getting together to fight, to struggle, to achieve some specific and limited set of demands. This is a crucial tactic that revolutionaries have consciously used ever since, at least consciously used, I emphasise, though you can see older practical examples of this, since the early years of the Communist International, in the period after the Russian Revolution. It's interesting to see the context in which the United Front tactic was first consciously adopted as a method by revolutionaries. This came in 1921. In the period after the First World War, Germany was the major, not simply the major capitalist society in Europe, but one deeply unstable, riven by class struggle, with a mass communist party. It was the country where the possibility of revolution was most seriously posed after the success of the Russian Revolution, and a huge focus of the attention of the Communist International was on how to advance the struggle in Germany. In March 1921, the German Communist Party, which was a mass party with several 100,000 members, decided to launch an offensive against the capitalist state, and effectively carried out a set of actions known as the March Action, whose aim was to precipitate a revolutionary insurrection, the overthrow, in other words, of the existing state of what was called the Weimar Republic in Germany. Big problem. The mass of workers still supported the Social Democratic Party, the main reformist party in Germany. And indeed, the action involved sometimes physical confrontations between communist workers and sections of these dominant social democratic labour movement. In other words, the March Action was a complete disaster that led to a very serious defeat for the Communist Party, a decline in its forces, and so on and so forth. It's a good or very bad example of what happens when revolutionaries lose sight of the necessity of winning the majority of the working class. In the aftermath to that, at the third Congress of the Communist International that took place just after the failure of the March Action, Lenin and Trotsky and the other leaders of the Bolshevik Party, which had taken power or led the Russian workers to power a few years earlier in Russia, argued that it was crucial to retreat from any such attempts at insurrection, and instead for the German Communist Party and the other communist parties in the established capitalist countries to orient themselves on a united front whose aim was to create a bridge between them and the reformist workers who made up the mass of the working class. And it's important to see that the United Front has a kind of dual quality, that the United Front is a struggle around demands that are necessary to take the working class forward. A very obvious example today is we need very broad and active United Fronts against the cuts, against the Tory Liberal coalition's offensive against public spending and so on and so forth. So the rationale for United Fronts arise from the needs of the class struggle. But there's another function of United Fronts, in that they can serve as a means in which revolutionaries establish the credibility of their politics with reformist workers and can begin to draw those reformist workers towards them, to get those reformist workers to start following the initiatives that revolutionaries can take, and and ultimately to win those reformist workers to the Revolutionary Party itself. So, very often, the problem of what tactics to adopt are to do with this imperative of reaching deeper into a working class majority that is profoundly influenced by reformism. And in this context, there are two temptations that face revolutionaries, two wrong paths to take. One is opportunism, and the other is sectarianism. Opportunism is essentially saying all that counts is the tactic. The great theorist of right-wing reformism in Germany, Edward Bernstein, put it very well when he said the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. In other words, the tactics that we're doing at the time are all that matter. And particularly when a party is using primarily electoral tactics, you can see how that can then ossify, consolidate into a reformist orientation. The second mistaken position is sectarianism. Sectarianism is saying all that counts is the goal of overthrowing capitalism. And all these tactics that you talk about are dangerous compromises or even betrayals that take us away from the revolutionary goal. What's interesting is that both those positions have a crucial point in common. A refusal to believe that the working class as it is can ever become a revolutionary subject. And for the opportunist, the conclusion is that we should just focus on essentially trying to achieve limited reforms. For the sectarian, the conclusion is a refusal to participate in real struggles because they're compromised by workers' acceptance of reformism and so on and so forth. Trotsky put it very well. He said, inside every sectarian is a frightened opportunist. Now, whereas if you compare Lenin has this very profound combination of absolutely undeviating fixation on the strategic objective of revolution with enormous tactical flexibility. And the bourgeois commentators and sometimes even Marxists say this is inconsistent, Lenin was just an opportunist and so on. It's a big mistake. The combination is dialectical. It's the strength of Lenin's strategic fixation, his confidence in the necessity and possibility of workers' power that allows him to engage in all sorts of tactical movements and compromises. And it's the question of flexibility, of the tactical flexibility for revolutionaries is very, very important. It's important because Tony Cliff, the founder of the SWP, used to say there's nothing more conservative than a revolutionary. And what he meant by that was that revolutionaries, we build an organisation, we build it around particular tactics, and it's very easy to become totally invested in those particular tactics. So that what we do kind of freezes into the tactics that fitted in a particular situation. The problem with that is sharp turns in history. When the situation qualitatively changes, when there's a new moment of crisis, that poses a new set of choices, then the old tactics don't fit anymore. And very often you get a crisis inside the revolutionary organisation between those who say the old tactics are good, we should stick to them, and those who say the situation has changed, we need to move on. Lenin famously talks about bending the stick. In other words, when he proposed a tactical turn in the Bolshevik Party, he would present his arguments in an extreme and exaggerated form, and often would make things seem as if everything the Bolsheviks had done previously were complete rubbish. So there's an enormous element of exaggeration in how Lenin argued for tactical turns. The rationale for that was to try, it was part of his method of breaking through the accumulated conservatism of the organisation to make a shift. Now, you know, we're small beers, I've tried to emphasise, in the SWP, compared to the Bolsheviks who actually led a successful socialist revolution. But this pattern of often a kind of conservative identification with a tactic that fitted in a particular period that then produces a crisis when the situation changes is something that we've experienced ourselves. I mean, the SWP went through quite a serious crisis between 2007 2009 that was started off with the things falling apart inside Respect. But really what was at work then, we didn't realise it to begin with, but became clearer and clearer as time went on, was that the kind of tactics that we had developed when the situation changed with the demonstrations in Seattle in 1999 and then after 9/11 with the emergence of the anti-war movement, the tactics that essentially focused upon building the broad anti-war and anti-capitalist movements no longer fitted the situation. Partly because those movements had gone into decline, but fundamentally because of the outbreak of the economic crisis and the way in which that required a rigorous change in everything that we did. And so the crisis that we experienced then was to do with us coming to realise that we needed a fundamental reorientation of our tactics. So that's an example of how even, you know, relatively modest revolutionary organisations can experience these kinds of problems. Now, two points and then final points, and then I'll shut up. Running through, for us as revolutionaries in Britain, with the oldest labour movement in the world and a still deeply entrenched reformism still deeply entrenched, both reflected in workers' enduring loyalty towards labourism, but also in the strength of the trade union bureaucracy inside the unions. We have constantly, whatever there are changes in the situation and the emphasis of what we do and the particular tactics that we do, but finding ways of wearing down the hold of reformism on the mass of workers remains a continuing problem for us. And that's why the tactic of the United Front is so important, because it's the key tool. This is something that Lenin, Trotsky and Gramsci, in their different ways, all emphasise. It's the key tool in which revolutionaries can get into the base of the reformists. It's a key tool because it doesn't involve just standing and saying, you reformists sell out, you're bastards, we hate you, and so on and so forth. It's a way of putting both our politics and that of the reformists to the test when we work together in concrete movements and struggles. I would say that's even more important now, because Labour's out of office, Labour is beginning to position itself against the cuts, and therefore that's going to increase the importance for us of building united fronts with people who look towards Labour that will put our politics to the test, but also will put theirs. Final point. The question of strategy and tactics, I hope I've shown, isn't just a theoretical question, although it is a theoretical question. Theory isn't just about, you know, the theory of alienation or the falling rate of profit. Its theory is also to do with the politics of revolution as well. But it isn't just a theoretical question. It's absolutely central to the practice of building a revolutionary party.
Now I'm going to open it up for people to join in the discussion, make points, ask questions if you want to. If you put your hands up, and you'll have 3 minutes to speak.
You're scared.
Yeah.
No, it's Alex. It's
Yeah. Oh yeah, and if people could come down and use the mic because the meeting is being recorded. And I'll call 2 people at a time so that we try and not have too much gaps in between.
I haven't quite organised my thoughts. My name is Shirley Franklin and I'm the chair of the Defend the Whittington Hospital Coalition. And it's that as a united front that I want to talk about. We set ourselves up, I mean it was Candy and myself really, but right at the beginning of it, because we were really shocked that they wanted to close our accident emergency along with other services in our local hospital. And actually that is the best sort of activity that you can get into. Anybody that's going to attack their local hospital is going to be incredibly unpopular. Nobody wants to see their local A&E attacked. So what we did was we set ourselves up as a coalition. Already there was a Labour group, there was a Liberal Democrat group, but we wanted to be across the parties, which is why we called ourselves Coalition. But we now have become a coalition of resistance. Because what we've done in our struggle is that we've not only joined up with political parties, we've also joined up with trade unionists in the area, but also trade unionists in the hospital. And what we managed to do was organise a hospital meeting. We had one of the biggest local marches. It was absolutely stunning. We had 5,000 people in Islington that marched against this closure. We also had some interesting tactics and strategy, I should guess the two together, around the election. Because I wrote to Nick Clegg, to Andrew Lansley and to Mike O'Brien, leaders, health people and leaders of the 3 main parties. And ironically, only Andrew Lansley said he'd turn up. And it was that sort of strategy, and it was a week before the election, and it really shifted the position, and the decision to close our accident and emergency suddenly was retracted. And I think it's to do with the fact that we'd had a march, we had 17,000 petitions, we had this coalition of resistance that swung it. And not only did it swing it for the Whittington, we actually swung it for the whole of London. So that was just a really effective series of tactics, I would say, that temporarily saved A&Es. I have to say it's temporary because, of course, now they're rethinking it. But we are continuing our struggle, and what we've managed to do now is actually, the week after, what happened in Islington was that the Labour group actually increased their majorities. So we had an MP who was on the margins, who I really pushed to come at the forefront of our demo, increased her majority from 400 and something to 4,000 and something. It was fantastic. Jeremy Corbyn massively increased his majority, and then our Liberal Democrat council became a Labour council. That's become a Labour council that's very much against the cuts. And what we've managed to do is form a coalition with them now. So we've got Islington TUC and the Labour group and us, Defend the Whittington, which are all working together in an anti-cuts coalition. So that's brilliant. Incidentally, we're organising a coach to Hinchinbrook Hospital next Saturday, because Hinchinbrook is going to be the first hospital whose management is going to be privatised. So please get in touch with Defend Whittington on our email account if you're interested in joining that demonstration. That's really important. So we're managing to have this kind of reformist, if you like, perspective that's quite angry. It's something we've not had in Islington for a long time. A really strong, powerful group. But the challenge, I think, is the revolutionary element, is really to work with people, bring them here. And it is quite challenging, because people that get involved in sort of hospital campaigns are very, very new to politics. So we've got these great new people. We've got some old hands who aren't necessarily in our politics. And the challenge is to move it onwards, I think.
Let's read my thoughts in order as well. One of the issues that's obviously come out of this lecture is the difference between the strategy and tactics, and at the moment of the global strategy. Can you hear me? Is that better? Yes. Very nerve-wracking, isn't it? One of the fundamental differences is that our strategy is obviously to create a more moral society, and I think the left wing obviously has the moral high ground, and the majority of the population realise that. But in terms of tactics, they're obviously not being mobilised at the moment. The people like me who have never know nothing about Marxism until they come to these conferences realise that something needs to change within society, but there's not yet the groundwork laid down to do that. So my argument would in fact be reformist, that we need to strengthen the more left-wing aspects of the state and pursue the more single-issue agendas, first to allow demonstration, if you'd like, to roll back the anti-progressive measures for the police targeting demonstrations and so on, and then secondly, when the crisis comes, whether it be cultural or ecological, that the leftist movement will be in a better position, because as it was rightly pointed out, at the moment it is pitifully small and it is not engaging. And I think it's partly why people don't know how to get involved, and we haven't got the single issue awareness of it yet. Thank you.
Well, my English is not very good, so I think this is really scary. Anyway, I wanted to say something to illustrate the importance for socialist parties to take part in the elections. As you can see, I don't know if you heard about that, Die Linke in Germany. I think you all know that party. Party took part in the elections in several states in Germany. And they actually won, because it's in times of crisis, they give us. They were the only party who were saying actually, who were against the cuts and who were saying the rich should pay for the crisis. And at the same time, they were strongly connected with the union and the movement and the movements. So, well, the important thing is taking part in the elections, but also at the same time being on the streets yourselves. Then I wanted to say something about the Dutch elections. We just had elections, and who won? It was the liberal VVD, the party who wanted to cut the hardest of them all. So actually the most neoliberal party. Why did they win? It's really interesting to look at that question. Everyone said in the media, in politics said, okay, to come out of this crisis, we need to cut as much as possible, and then we will be out of it really fast. So I think that was the reason what makes people vote for that liberal party. Of course, we can also get the money where it is, by the rich people. And while many people who already saw that voted for the left to oppose actually the cuts of the VVD. So this situation, it was the Labour Party was used actually to vote mostly against the racism of Geert Wilders, the VVD, but also for some people against the cuts of the VVD, because they thought, okay, Labour is going to save us. It's much more social. But the reality is that the Labour Party in the Netherlands wants the cuts, just as hard as the neoliberal party. And the ruling class now actually wants the Labour Party to take part in the government, actually to weaken the Labour Party, and also to weaken the union, which is strongly connected to the Labour Party. What we need is a sound from the left, which has, okay, we don't have to pay for the crisis. Cuts are not necessary. The rich can pay their own crisis. And the party who oppose the racism of the PVV. Because what you can see with the Socialist Party, they won a lot in 2006 with the last elections. And at that time there were the anti-war votes, the anti-racism votes, and that's give them a lot of votes. But they came with 25 people in the parliament. And okay, they were at last. Can you last they were opposing the cuts and stuff, but you didn't hear that much from them. And now people are disappointed, and they switched to the PVV. And what is the conclusion of the top of the Socialist Party? Okay, then we should copy some elements of the PVV to get our voters back. Now what we need is a party which opposes at the same time the cuts and say, okay, we don't have to pay for the crisis to defend our rights, and also oppose the racism and nationalism, to be solidary with the fights against cuts, for example, in Greece and everywhere else in Europe. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. And I am trying to keep people to 3 minutes so that we can fit everybody in. So when I tap, that means you've got a minute left.
I hope that my question is going to be a little bit clear, but I'm not sure. You know what I mean. I felt from your contribution, your introduction, Alex, that you were talking as if there were some different tactics and one revolutionary strategy. You know, you talked about tactical turns. About Lenin, you said, you know, there were a combination of brilliant tactical agility and principled strategic principles. So my question is that question, does it mean that there's only one revolutionary strategy? Because when we go to this question in Gramsci, for example, he explains the difference, in some ways, he explains the difference between tactics and strategy in terms of conjunctures, and, you know, some change in situation, localizing time, questions, and so on, and organic change, some change for the logic and the dynamic of an old period. And so, because my argument is that I think that even as revolutionaries, there are some, I would say, some strategic principles. There was a question of the state, smashing the state, the question of another power to build what you call the question of Soviets or councils and so on, an alternative power confronting at one point the states, or the question of the party, are big strategic principles. We're not dealing with question of periods. But at the same time, it's not enough, I think, for a strategy, because strategy is a road, in some ways, a road from now toward this the question of the revolution. And just to finish, I just give an example. I think that what we called the question of regroupment of the radical left is a strategical question for us, linked to the need to rebuild the working class, a new working class movement, and so on. You know, it can have some tactical differences between the countries. You know, for example, us, you know, we are not building this question of regroupment tactically. We are not pushing it in the same way in France with the new anti-capitalist party that the German comrades with Die Linke and so on. There are some tactical differences. Maybe we can have some discussion on the strategy behind it. But I think there's a strategical question behind it, which means that we are doing this now. We were not doing it 10 years ago. So that was, you know,
I am from Turkey. My English is not so good, but I will try my best to express my ideas. I think a new phenomenon has been going on for the last couple of years, and that is we are living in a post-industrial world. And I think the working class has transformed itself. We have a new generation of young people who are very much influenced by the internet, by the prevailing dominant ideology that is about consuming and etc. And more people identify themselves, especially the white-collar working class people that I am talking about. They are identifying themselves with the new, they are themselves with the bourgeois class in terms of consumption patterns and so on. So what is the best strategy to reach these new young generations? Now there is a saying in Europe, and that is young people, 1,000 euro youth. You know, like they only earn about 1,000 euro per month, but they are very much influenced by consumption and so on. So what is the best tactic to reach them? Nowadays more and more people are working, not in factories, but in small offices, in front of computers, being alienated in Marxian terms. Thank you very much.
No, you were first.
I don't know how to use it. Fine?
Yeah.
I want to bring a different argument to what Alex was saying. In terms of internationalism, and we as Marxists and Leninists, there is a new political reality is going to be will face us in 7 months, which is the American imperialists plus the British and the European Union. There is a referendum going to be in Sudan. The Southern Sudan could separate. That will have an impact on Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Central Africa, Chad, Libya, and Egypt. And a new phase of political economy is going to be there. And we have theoretically to prepare ourselves to face it, and politically to support the people who are opposing the government there in Sudan, which is the European Union now supporting it, the Americans supporting it, and the Chinese supporting it, which is the whole the global imperialism. And even worse than that, Blackwater, I don't know, they changed their name now, they built bases on Southern Sudan, which is any revolutionary movement in East Africa or other, they could move and smash it. Nowadays, the doctors in Sudan, more than 3 weeks they are on strike. The security forces, they stopped the Communist Party newspaper. And they got back to school and they get arresting the Communist Party members. And last week, the head of the intelligence was here in Britain to connect. And the British government now donating for the referendum about 90 million pounds, which is all good. So I think we need to rethink about a new international situation.
Hello, my name is Asset from the Netherlands. I want to make a point, Alex brushed on the subject already, and that is the point of self-confidence. I'm not really experienced, so I don't know much about complicated politics and tactics, but I think the point of self-confidence is very, very important. We say power to the people, but what does that mean? We do not want to bring the power to the people, because the people already have the power. But what we need to realize, and what the people need to realize, is we have the power, we only have to use the power, and then we can really change things. So that's a lacking of confidence. And I see that when I discuss socialism with my friends. They say socialism doesn't work. Democracy doesn't even work because humans are just too stupid. Look what they vote. It's not in their interest. It's stupid. But when they say humans are stupid, they are themselves humans as well. So they say, I am stupid as well because I'm a human. And that causes some sort of lack of self-confidence. And what I think that we need to realize, what is very important for us, for the workers, is that we can fight and that we can win.
So your point about union I find really, really interesting, but it seems like it's mostly in front of a crisis, so in front of the cuts, in front of a war, then everyone gets together. And what about when there is no crisis? How do you think the socialists should get with any party that wants to work together? And if so, how to manage that everyone has equal powers and everyone has a say? Because in history, it seems like a lot of the coalition, the main party just naps all the power at the end, like during the Front Populaire in France or during Mitterrand or even here with the Lib Dem. And so, yeah, that was the two questions.
I did actually call you next, but I'll let Maxine go. It's all right. Go on then.
I've been in the SWP since I was 21, which means that I clearly see myself as being a revolutionary socialist. However, for the last 6 years, I've also stood in local elections and in general elections. And the reason why is because I believe that we have to use all opportunities possible to expose the ruling class and their system. And one of the ways in which we've been able to do that is by, for example, in the most recent election, we were able to put out effectively the centre page of Socialist Worker in our election leaflet across a quarter of the area of Sheffield. And I think that that's quite important. And I think it's also important that in doing that, we were able to debate and try to expose the Labour Party and the Liberals as well in Sheffield. And I think in many of the platforms we were able to bring a number of people towards us. Now, I mean, I think that means that we have to be engaged in tackling reformism, because reformism is alive and kicking, big style really, and we do have to make sure that we engage with the most advanced sections. And I think that whereas Lenin talked about the most important question is the overthrow of capitalism, and the class struggle is the most important question, because in the process of people fighting, they change themselves. He said that we shouldn't dismiss the tactics of elections and other different tactics that you could adopt. And I mean, I think that, Alex talked about it, about Lenin's arguments about a revolution is like trying to climb up the highest mountain. The idea that you would climb a high mountain without thinking that you have to zigzag across it in order to make your ascent up there, or sometimes you might even have to retrace your steps. This is what Lenin's talking about in terms of the tactics that you have to adopt, really. As long as your eye is still on the prize of revolution, that's the most important question. And, I mean, I think for us today, we can see the massive cuts that are going to be taking place. I mean, I think, you know, if you think about your workplace and 25% of the people are going to go, then actually this government is a weak and nasty government, and they're going to attack people big style. And therefore, we need to be arguing very much using the united front tactics to try and argue to fight back against it. And in the process of working in a united front, we can win people towards revolutionary politics by proving that we are the best. A good example is that we are uniting with people from the Labour Party at the moment around the question of the Right to Work campaign against the cuts, the protests that took place the other week when they announced the budget cuts. And the Labour Party spoke on the platform, and they spoke very well, and they organised actually protest against the Liberals when Clegg visited the city. He actually he couldn't even get in the front entrance of the town hall because people are so angry at him. On the other hand, they organised a protest against a gypsy site in Burngrave, and therefore we have to be inside of that milieu to take on the arguments. Actually, you can't start scapegoating other people. We have to build amongst the best people. And I mean, I think we have to, I'm not quite sure how things are going to go in the coming year, and I think things really stand a bit in the balance, really. But I think we have a reformist party that is incapable of delivering any reforms at the moment, and therefore I think we do have to make sure that we have extreme flexibility, really, in terms of the tactics we adopt. In the meanwhile, making sure we're quite hard and fast that ultimately we have to overthrow capitalism.
Yeah, we're looking at examples of Lenin and tactics and strategy, and of course there are fantastic examples from the Russian Revolution at the absolute height of Lenin's application of his grasp of tactics. Just to take one example, there is a point, the date completely escapes, it might be March for something or other, when there is an enormous mood inside Petrograd for an armed demonstration that will show workers' preparedness to challenge to take state power. And the Bolsheviks are on the point of supporting Lenin's party, on the point of supporting the armed demonstration, and of course everyone looks to them and expects that they will support the demonstration. But at the last minute, there's an intervention by one of the leading committees of the Soviets, the workers' councils themselves. And this leading committee, for various reasons, a little bit more timid, says that there mustn't be any such armed demonstration and insists on it being called off. Now, Lenin says at this point we had no choice. We had to call off the demonstration. There is a mass disaffection, to put it mildly, in the Bolshevik party. People tear up their membership cards. But Lenin says we had no choice. We were banned, he says. We were banned by the semi-power from going ahead with the armed demonstration. This is I got this from Tony Cliff's Lenin, Volume 1. It's not original research or anything, but just the turn of phrase, I think, is fantastic. Banned by the semi-power. He refers to the Workers' Council movement as being half of the power in the land, which he hopes, of course, will be the main power in a matter of months. And he says we're banned, which is quite a heavy way of referring to the mood of the committee in the Works Councils. But he says this in order to emphasise that we must not race ahead. And he comes out with the phrase, we must patiently explain what we are about. We must patiently explain the need for an armed insurrection before we toy with it or appear to be dabbling with it. He says that in the teeth of great opposition and large-scale disillusionment, to be honest, until he manages to win around. So the man who has come back from exile in February saying down with the provisional government, it must be overthrown, it doesn't change his mind on the long-term strategy, but on the tactics says we must not argue for an armed overthrow before we have patiently explained to people what we are about and the need for it. We must not think that the mood right here is the mood throughout the entire country. A fantastic example of the right application of the tactics which ultimately led to a successful revolution.
Sorry to all the people who put their hands up.
I think a very well quoted book over this weekend, I'm sure. I think it's also in Lenin Volume 1 that Cliff says that Marx would still have been Marx if he hadn't founded the First International, but if Lenin hadn't founded the Bolshevik Party, it would not have been Lenin. And what Cliff means when he says this, and it's in the chapter where he's discussing specifically Lenin's contribution to strategy and tactics, what he's alluding to is how is it that the Bolshevik Party arrived at the correct tactics? Because it's not the case that you would read in some of the Stalinist hack works that Lenin was some sort of prophet, that Lenin simply knew these things because he could see the future or something like that. Actually, what happened was that Lenin, by building the Bolshevik Party, built an organization that was able to centralize the experience of the Russian working class. If you read the experience in the book on Lenin, Cliff talks about how people would come and visit Lenin in exile, and Lenin would sit them down and listen to everything they had to say, every detail about what was going on in the shop floor. And it was this way that Lenin and the Bolshevik Party were able to arrive at the correct tactics, not through some sort of super brain that simply arrived at the right things by reading the newspapers. And I think that has important ramifications for what we're trying to do today. I mean, when we're trying to arrive at the right tactics for our engagement with how we build against the cuts, how we build against the fascists. What that means is that we need to have a revolutionary organisation with strong roots in the working class, with strong roots in the communities around this country. And the stronger we are, the bigger we are, the stronger we are. And I think that what we need to take from this is that for everyone in this room, for everyone at this festival who's interested in being involved in that, we would encourage you to join the SWP, because the other thing about what Lenin was trying to do when he was building his organisation was not simply about centralising, but about democracy within the organisation. It's not possible to arrive at the right tactics unless there is full and thorough debate, unless there is proper reflection on what went wrong. And by being involved in these discussions, we're much better positioned to come to the right conclusions next time round. So, for example, when Cliff talks about Lenin bending the stick, he would say, yeah, we exaggerated, we got some things wrong, but let's learn that for the next time. And I think that that's incredibly crucial in the months and the years to come. And so, just to end, really, we've had a lot of talk about reforms and the best way of winning reforms. I think that one thing that our ruling class knows is that the best way of winning reforms is not through reformism. I mean, if we look to the winning of universal suffrage, if we look to the winning of the welfare state in this country, it didn't come about through gradual reforms. It came because our rulers were afraid of the threat of social revolution. And I think that says a lot about how we, as people who want to see the world change, need to organise. And I hope that for those people who are not members of the SWP, you seriously consider joining us.
If you want to continue the debate, the next meeting in this series is Wider Revolutionary Standing Elections that Maxime Bowler will be speaking at, and that's tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Also tomorrow, just before Alex comes back, I'll give a couple of announcements. There is a showing of some of the video from Chris Harman's memorial, and that will be shown tomorrow at 5:15 in the Clark Hall. There's also still a need for people to offer accommodation, floor space, and if anybody hasn't got accommodation, the place to go for either of those things is the accommodation office, which is in Ulu. And there is a luggage room in room 777 on the 7th floor here. Alex, would you like to come back on that very good discussion?
Okay, yes, thanks. Very interesting discussion. I just want to make a few points. I mean, what I think part of the thrust of what Denis was saying was to bring out that, as I said, when Lenin talks about the distinction between strategy and tactics, he's essentially adapting a distinction that arises from military doctrine. So it's the distinction between strategy and tactics as used in revolutionary politics is a metaphor. And metaphors are only partially fully applied. And I think maybe what Denis was trying to say, get me to confront, was the possibility that one can talk at three levels. One is that of fundamental revolutionary principle. Secondly, of strategies reflecting different circumstances and situations. And thirdly, of tactics. And you know, I think that there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, leaving aside the example that Denis said, there are clearly differences between how revolutionaries, what a revolution would mean in a country like this one, a developed capitalist society where the mass of people are wage labourers, and so on and so forth, and a country in the global south. I mean, there's a meeting on South Africa taking place at this time. In South Africa, 40% of the population of the workforce are unemployed. There are massive struggles over access to land and so on. In other words, there are important structural differences between the kind of capitalism that exists in South Africa and that exists here. Does that make strategic difference? What does it mean in terms of struggles in the countryside in particular? What about countries where there's still real peasantries in a way that there aren't even in South Africa? One can say that maybe there's strategic differences at that kind of level. So I don't really disagree with what Denis is saying, although and I don't think he'll disagree with what I'm going to say now, which is that I think it's important to see that the fundamental revolutionary principles constrain both strategy or strategies and tactics. And one critical one is the question of self-activity. In other words, the kind of tactics that we use and the particular approach that we make to the tactics are always dictated by the importance of raising the self-activity of the exploited and the oppressed. So when Maxine talked about the kind of election campaigns that she's been involved in Sheffield, one of the things she's saying is when revolutionaries stand for elections, we stand in a different way from the candidates of bourgeois parties, including for these purposes the Labour Party. We campaign in a way that may not always get us huge numbers of votes, but that nevertheless encourages people to get self-organised, to get active, to fight for themselves, to link up, and so on and so forth. That's one example, but I think it runs through all the different tactics we adopt. Secondly, the guy from Turkey who raised the question of the nature of our societies. I'm sorry, I think the idea of post-industrial societies is a load of nonsense. I can't find a polite way of putting it. All these, €1,000 youngsters and so on, what do they want? What they want, to a large extent, are material things. iPods, iPads, so on and so forth. I mean, it's true that we live in a society that's permeated by consumerism in different forms, but consumerism is about consuming still, to a large extent, things, and those things are produced in factories and things like that, and all those factories haven't migrated to China as well. So I think it's quite unhelpful to talk about post-industrial society. I think what is true is the traditional labour movement is in crisis, and that a lot of the methods of organising that developed in the course of the 20th century have been undermined by the way in which capitalism, partly by the way in which capitalism has restructured itself in the past few decades, but more critically by the kind of defeats that workers have suffered. And the labour movement collectively is still in the process of trying to discover more effective ways of waging struggles in the same conditions. But we can see examples of how to organise effectively in the present situation. When Shirley was talking about the Whittington campaign, that's actually an example of a kind of new form of working class organisation in the conditions of contemporary capitalism. The point that was raised about, really, I think, the conditions for United France. First of all, what happens when there aren't crises? Well, when I said Marxism was a theory of crisis, part of the bottom line of the theory is that, as the one great Marxist, Walter Benjamin, put it, the crisis, as he put it, the state of emergency is permanent. Not that there's just one continuous crisis, but because of the degree of instability that's inherent in capitalism, certainly in its current phase of development, crises are going to come along all the time. Now, one of the problems is, unless you think you're God, and certainly Marx and Lenin and so on, very far from thinking of themselves as God, you can't anticipate the precise timing and character of particular crises. So and this relates to some of the things that Johnny was saying at the end of the discussion, part of building an effective revolutionary organisation is one that has sufficient intellectual openness and organisational flexibility to respond effectively to changes in the situation, because the crises will, in all sorts of ways, be unexpected. The other aspect of that question was how do you secure equality between the different organisations involved in a coalition? The truth is you can't. The relationship between different organisations is going to reflect a balance of... No, you haven't given me 10 minutes yet, sorry. Negotiation going on here. The relationship between the different forces taking part in a coalition is going to reflect some kind of real relationship of forces within that coalition, or reflecting the larger power in society of the different forces. this is an important point partly because there's a tradition among more orthodox Trotskyists of calling for united fronts between, in the days when there were mass communist parties in Europe, united fronts between the social democratic and communist parties in order to achieve certain objectives, which were a caricature of the united front, because what united fronts are, as I try to bring out, were revolutionaries and reformists coming together. But it's only going to be under particular conditions where revolutionaries are in a position to draw reformists into effective united fronts. And therefore we have to be quite realistic about the possibilities. The leadership of the SWP could go to the TUC General Council and say, we need to have a united front against the Kurds. But, if they let us into the room, they would soon laugh us out of it. However, when it comes to the question of fascism and mobilising against the Nazis, where there's an emphasis on campaigning, on mobilising from below, on the use of imagination, which isn't something that the trade union bureaucracy is very strong about, there you discover that it is possible to have a united front. So it partly depends on the issue. And one of the things that revolutionaries have to do is to look very realistically about the kind of conditions in which they can have united fronts. And it can be quite difficult. I mean, what the comrade said about Die Linke was interesting, but there are revolutionaries in and building Die Linke, and quite rightly so. But it's what makes Die Linke such a powerful force is partly the fact that powerful, essentially social democratic forces have invested Die Linke in order to build it in a way that will renew essentially social democracy reformism in Germany, and how relatively small numbers of revolutionaries are able to maintain some sort of unity that achieves things, that takes things forward with some of these reformist forces is quite a challenging question. But I am quite optimistic about the possibilities of building real fighting united fronts in this country at the present time. When Shirley talked about coalition, the Whittington campaign being a coalition of resistance, that's an example. We can build against the Liberal Conservative coalition real coalitions of resistance up and down the country and on a national scale that can demonstrate how revolutionaries in practice can make a difference.